Welcome to this videocast from Australian Community Futures Planning on the State of Australia in 2020. I'm Bronwyn Kelly, the founder of ACFP, and this series covers the facts about the health and well-being of Australia's society, environment, economy and democracy. The issues listed here are among the most important for Australia to solve before 2030. Failure to make substantial progress on these issues in the coming decade will make it harder and far more costly for Australians to arrive safely in 2050 with an acceptable degree of well-being and security. This particular episode of the State of Australia in 2020 takes a detailed look at the deterioration of our relationships with other nations, our reduced reliance on diplomacy, our shift towards a hawkish stance in foreign policy dominated by secretive intelligence, security and defence agencies, and our prospects for safety and security in the coming decades under different approaches to foreign relations. The purpose is to ensure that as Australians begin to work together to develop a plan for safely arriving in 2050 with an acceptable degree of well-being and security, they can actually start with an accurate understanding of facts about current foreign policy and its potential impacts on our economy and on our international reputation as a good country to invest in, trade with and cooperate with. This is essential because in 2020, Australia is at a turning point for policy on security and international relations. Depending on our decisions and our attitudes to other countries, things can turn decidedly worse or better for Australia. Since we are situated in the Asia-Pacific, we are geographically central to the theatre of the 21st century global regime change, which will feature the inevitable rise of China. No strategy for Australia's security and the safety of Australians can be developed outside this context. This episode can be viewed in 5 sections. Section 1 covers Australians' current attitudes to foreign relations, particularly with China, and the impact on our security and sovereignty. Section 2 covers the likely effectiveness of aggressive attitudes to and policies on China. Section 3 covers Australia's shift to isolationism and away from multilateralism and cooperation, and how this is actually undermining the rules-based order we have supported since World War II. Section 4 covers the threats posed to Australia's values as a liberal democracy from within Australia itself, and Section 5 covers Australia's best strategy for safety and security. In 2019, a consortium of Australian businesses, non-profit organisations, universities and professionals worked together to produce the Australian National Outlook 2019. The consortium, headed by the CSIRO and National Australia Bank, came up with 2 possible outlooks for Australia by 2060. One was a slow decline vision in which Australia fails to adequately address the challenges identified, leading to poorer outcomes in multiple dimensions. The second scenario was what they called an outlook vision, representing what could be possible if Australia can achieve its full potential. The outlook vision was a good deal more enjoyable to think about than the slow decline. The slow decline scenario assumed that Australia would not adapt to challenges such as climate change and global power shifts, and consequently it predicted lower GDP, lower real wages, sprawling, poorly connected cities, high carbon emissions and pollution, high energy prices, poor returns to landholders, a denuded environment and lost biodiversity. The outlook vision, by contrast, assumed that Australia would adapt to challenges and consequently predicted higher GDP growth, higher real wages, denser and well-connected cities, Net zero carbon emissions, low energy prices, high returns to landholders, a restored environment and thriving biodiversity. It was a jolly good news story and not at all unachievable. One of the important things the consortium identified as critical to Australia's capacity to make the Outlook vision a reality was to ensure that we remain an inclusive society appreciating diversity. But another prerequisite, essential to achievement of the more optimistic outlook, was to ensure that we do our best not to embed fractious international relations and an uncooperative stance on the global stage, particularly in scientific research and negotiations on carbon emissions reduction. Unfortunately, in 2020, Australia isn't exactly leading the world with cooperative stances either in climate negotiations and research or in international relations generally. If anything, we have become more defensive in stance in relation to national interests in climate talks, less cooperative in joint research projects, gratuitously offensive in foreign policy and posture, and less engaged with our principal trading partner, China, a rising force we must surely seek to count as a friend. Instead of engaging with China, the government has shifted its language of diplomacy to characterise China more as an enemy and a threat than as a friend and a partner. Characterisations of China have slipped away from acknowledging it as a power whose rise enhances our own and towards an idea that its rise threatens our value system, as if suddenly working with China would mean we had somehow surrendered our values and even our sovereignty and opened the way for our democracy to be supplanted by an authoritarian system. At home, these new characterisations have been quite effective in shifting Australians' attitudes to the rising power that is China. According to the 2020 Lowy Institute poll of Australian attitudes to the world, in only 2 years since the introduction of our more confrontationist and less cooperative diplomatic discourse with China, Australians' trust in China and its leader, Xi Jinping, has more than halved. Australians may well have identified good reasons for their new views and would be likely to cite China as a country whose values differ from Australia's in relation to human rights and democracy. In human rights, Australians may cite China's treatment of the Uyghur minority in its Xinjiang province as a good reason for taking issue with China. In relation to democracy, they may cite China's recent changes in national security laws, which have the effect of criminalising dissent in Hong Kong. They may look suspiciously on China's construction of military bases in the South China Sea and their Belt and Road initiative, which involves the construction of major economic cooperation corridors and several key maritime pivot points across Eurasia and the Indo-Pacific region. An investment strategy designed to ensure trading connections remain open between China and its major markets and suppliers, including Australia. Australians may also feel that Australia's own very poor record in human rights in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and refugees is no reason to withhold judgment about value systems which are more authoritarian than Australia's. But looking suspiciously on China over these apparent clashes of value systems has escalated to a point in 2020 where Australians are retreating from the partnership we have enjoyed with China over the past couple of decades and into a fearful mindset that as China rises, the relationship will no longer work so well in Australia's favour. Instead of trying to make China's inevitable ascendancy as a global power work in our favour, Australia's government has, since 2017, set about antagonising China. We have switched from strategies we have pursued since the late 1980s to secure our future in Asia, over to strategies based on the notion that we must be secured from Asia's biggest power, China. There are no prizes for guessing how that will work out, and no point in pulling punches about it. Australia will lose. In Section 2, I'll show just how ineffective our recent treatment of China will be if we keep it up. There is no reason for any Australian to think that China is a military threat to Australia. As more than one experienced diplomat has pointed out, exercising military power to create the New World Order is not part of China's grand strategy, and never has been. Hemmed in as China is by 14 other countries, none of whom are allies, and an ocean dominated by an adversary with a history of gratuitous aggression in Asia, the USA, military strength is for China's own security, not regional or global hegemony. Former diplomat Jeff Raby is not alone in this view, counter though it may be to the preferred characterisations of China from Canberra hawks. With the problem that will never go away for China arising from its geographical containment and a history of centuries of being the victim of exploitation and aggression, China has much bigger things to worry about than Australia, like whether it can continue to feed its people if the US cuts off its access to vital energy resources. This is something the US is well positioned to do by its control of the island chains in the West Pacific and the Straits of Malacca. But even if Jeff Raby turns out to be wrong at some future point in history about China's global power intentions, there is no reason in the present for Australians to assume that should push come to shove with China, that other Asian countries will put themselves in harm's way to side with us against China. Nor can we have much confidence, if any, that the US will come to our aid in either military difficulties or trade. The US will and does make its own arrangements with China, regardless of how it affects Australia's trade balance or security. And by building military bases in Australia, the US has shown a preference to put us in harm's way rather than keep us out of it. Situated where we are geographically, we have convenient uses as a buffer. And the USA likes proxy wars. We host US bases over which we have no control, and that, without our permission, can be used for nuclear war. The reality of the USA's history of gratuitous aggression in Asia should inform our decisions about which strategies will be effective in our region and which ones won't. Anti-China strategies, especially strategies in which we appear too eager to do the front running for the US, are risky for Australia. Nevertheless, as the results of the Lowy poll show, the collective headspace of Australians in 2020 is anti-China, and we are working on the assumption that we can effectively muscle up. Prior to 2019, the vast majority of Australians viewed China as an economic partner and not as a military threat. But in 2020, there was a big drop in the view that we are economic partners and a big rise in the view that China is a security threat. The Lowy poll question about whether China is a security threat is a very different question to the one it asked Australians up until 2018, which was whether China is seen as a military threat. Who knows what effect the Lowy Institute's change in its question for their 2020 poll had on our answers. But regardless of that, it would seem we are viewing China more in terms of confrontation than partnership, and seeking to become less dependent on China as a trading partner. In the Lowy poll, full 94% of those surveyed favoured working to find other markets for Australia to reduce our economic dependence on China, and 82% favoured imposing travel and financial sanctions on Chinese officials associated with human rights abuses. The impulse to be less dependent on China as a trading partner is easily viewed as sensible in a post-coronavirus world, particularly if it means we may repatriate some of our manufacturing from offshore and set ourselves up to produce within our borders more of the manufactured goods we currently import. But trade is a two-way street, so this impulse to reduce dependency on China doesn't work so well from the point of view of our exports. The balance of trade will inevitably suffer under a decoupling from China. More than that, the impulse for a relatively little country like Australia to impose sanctions for human rights abuses on a big country like China, even if it is just on some officials, is a step into policy that is likely to be ineffective at best and counterproductive at worst. We are very unlikely to punch successfully above our weight to the extent necessary for such sanctions to be both effective and consequence-free. The idea of such sanctions is also taking isolationism and nationalism to a level that is new for Australia. That particular impulse towards sanctions, with all its implications of moral superiority, may well be logical to all Australians who dearly value democracy and who are beginning to feel it may be under threat. But it may also be a somewhat less mature approach to the reality of what it takes for a middle power like Australia to get along in a modern, globalised world. This is not to suggest that we should set our values at naught. Far from it. But Australia is a middle power, and by population is a small power, and it will never be anything more. The reality is that if we keep carrying on like we are, needlessly antagonising our major trading partner, we are more likely to suffer sanctions than to be able to impose them. And indeed, that is what started to happen by mid-2020. Due to Australia having exposed itself through gauche diplomacy since 2017 to what will now be repeated rounds of Chinese trade conflicts, Australia lost exports to China in beef, barley, cotton, coal, wine, and some types of seafood. According to the University of Western Australia's Perth US Asia Centre, this wiped an estimated 19 billion of the annual value of our exports. An additional 28 billion worth of services exports could be at risk if Beijing's warnings to its citizens against travel to Australia, based on claims of an elevated risk of racist attacks, prevents a post-COVID recovery in tourism and international education. This is what sanctions feel like. The reality is that as China rises, Australia may be more likely to see its influence as a middle power wane rather than grow. So, plainly, if our objective is a world that is safer for free, democratic societies, we should be seeking more effective stratagems than sanctions of a few Chinese dignitaries. As a middle power, we need a cooperative approach on the international stage. Middle powers can be persuasive if they band together in orderly international forums. As Australia's Minister for Trade, Simon Birmingham, pointed out in 2020, if we look back in history, whilst great powers have yielded great influence, maybe middle powers, all working together and collegiately, have yielded perhaps more influence than we have traditionally given credit for. Indeed, as a middle power, we have yielded influence. Australia's participation as one of the founding countries of the United Nations and one of only 8 countries drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights after World War II is an example of how a middle power like Australia can punch above its weight for the betterment of all nations. We've done it, and done it well. But middle power influence only grows when it operates in a cooperative mode within those universal institutions. Outside those institutions, middle powers simply lose sway, and middle power influence doesn't work at all when the middle power becomes confrontational. And what is even more important to recognise is that middle powers only yield influence if they behave ethically and can be seen to be acting in good faith, collegiately, for the global good. We must be seen to be trustworthy. Demonstrated ethical and cooperative behaviour makes other countries feel they can rely on us to honour our commitments in trade and investment. Being seen to act ethically and consistently, both in domestic policy and foreign relations, is the key way to build what is known as soft power. This is the only type of power Australia will ever be able to amass enough of to use effectively in international relations. We will not be able to acquire enough hard power, by which I mean weapons and defence systems, to defend ourselves from a military strike or invasion. As former Ambassador to China Jeff Raby has made clear, we simply don't have the population to fund it. And because we cannot rely on our allies, including Britain and the US, to come to our aid in a crisis, Australia needs to acknowledge that, in the New World Order, the safest course is to work on the precautionary premise that we are on our own and build a strategy of cooperation with every nation, not just our traditional allies and not just with democracies. The only feasible strategy for Australia in armed conflict is to avoid it entirely in the first place. And that can only be done by high-class diplomacy and constant cultivation of soft power through a consistent display of ethics and commitment to the common good. At the end of 2020, Australia is chipping away at its stocks of soft power, particularly by acting poorly over climate change and refugees. And we are sharpening our hard power strategies. The net effect of this switch away from sound diplomacy and over to hawkish strategy dominated by our secretive intelligence, security and military officials is negative for Australia, economically and strategically, and will be negative now for a long time to come unless we switch back to cultivation of genuine soft power, meaning decency and trustworthiness in diplomacy, trade and investment. The sort of collaboration Australia engaged in at the UN in the late 1940s has merit as a mature way to approach international relations, and we have international forums set up to enable exactly this sort of maturity to flourish in the 2020s. Unfortunately, leaders in our government are currently setting Australia up to be less persuasive by undermining these forums and casting them as agents of coercive, negative globalism. Combined with our soft power credibility problems, this is dangerous territory for Australia to enter. And in the next sections, I'll look at how much more dangerous we can make our lives if at the same time we let ourselves be distracted from the task of protecting our democracy from domestic attack. It is Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison's view that forums like the United Nations should be avoided because they are supposedly unaccountable international bureaucracies that coercively seek to impose a mandate from an often ill-defined, borderless global community. Under my leadership, he says, Australia's international engagement will be squarely driven by Australia's national interests. The implication here is that we shouldn't cooperate in forums like the UN if, for example, they don't agree that Australia should be able to do less than its fair share in carbon emissions reduction, or if they don't agree that Australia should be able to violate international laws on refugees. And the implication is that we shouldn't participate in these international forums if they don't agree Australia should be able to break international laws, for instance, by bugging the cabinet meetings of other governments during trade or border negotiations, as we did in East Timor in 2004. Or if they don't agree that Australia should be able to act in contravention of other international conventions to which we've been a signatory for decades, including international conventions on the rights of children. Australia has been behaving poorly in relation to these rules on and off during the 21st century. This is the sort of behaviour that earns Australia ratings at the bottom of the list of responsible countries in climate change, or lower scores than we've been used to in the International Corruption Perceptions Index. It's not the sort of behaviour that will increase our influence or soft power. In that regard, it is of some concern that negative views of international cooperation may have cut through in the Australian collective consciousness, cut through in a way that suggests we might prefer a retreat to isolationism, or worse, to a position where we reject the need to abide by the very rules we worked hard to set up, unless it suits us. It suggests it's preferable to become dismissive of the institutions in which we have hitherto freely participated in support of the international rules-based order. When Australians were asked in the 2020 Lowy poll about their priorities in the event of a clash between the global interest in solving global problems and the domestic interests of individual countries, 66% of Australians said that the government should prioritise Australia's domestic interests over reaching a global agreement in an international institutions. Only a third of Australians said that the government should prioritise global agreement over Australia's domestic interests. This is as if the one isn't the other, as if our domestic interests do not inhere in global agreement, when of course our domestic interests depend on global agreement being amicably reached. In the absence of global agreement on vital things like climate, pandemics and trade rules, we know enough from 20th century miseries to understand that we will have economic disasters and wars if we constantly give preeminence to domestic interests, interests which will often turn out to be nothing more than a subset of our interests. They will often turn out to be the financial interests of a privileged few. Of course, the Lowy poll question, and the Australian government for that matter, are setting up a false binary. After all, what can we really say when limited to such an artificially oppositional choice and when no compromise option is on offer in the question? How differently might we answer if we were asked, for instance, whether we're prepared to do more than we're doing in, say, carbon emissions reduction, even though that may disadvantage our fossil fuel interests? If doing more on emissions reduction advantaged our children and the whole world economy, including ours, would we still insist on our narrow domestic interests being given overriding priority, especially if that priority is to preserve the interests of a few fossil fuel corporations and no one else? When it comes to global matters like these, the fact is there is no clash between global interests and the domestic interest. And to set up an idea that if the global interest is well served, this will come at Australia's cost instead of to Australia's benefit is entirely unhelpful and illusory. This Lowy question, the question of whether the government should prioritise Australia's domestic interests over reaching a global agreement, is a silly and useless question. But the fact that it was asked is indicative of the rise of oppositional discourse in our attitudes to international relations. This is a language that reduces Australians to less than they are and drags them towards a world of unnecessary diametric oppositions instead of back towards the multilateralism and multiculturalism we have enjoyed and made a great success of since World War II. The advent of coronavirus in 2020 has acted as a check, at least in part, on Australia's recent march into isolationism, which started with Scott Morrison's speech to the Lowy Institute in 2019. The speech where he railed against negative globalism and attempted coercion, as he called it, by unaccountable international bureaucracies. In foreign policy in 2020, the Morrison government seems to have realised, post-pandemic, that it's unrealistic to think we can cut ourselves adrift from the world and still be an influential middle power. And so, in our foreign policy stance, we shifted back somewhat towards supporting multilateralism. In mid-2020, Australia's Minister for Foreign Affairs, Marise Payne, acknowledged that the Prime Minister's preference for isolationism and nationalism might diminish our influence on the international stage. So she pivoted slightly on the Prime Minister's disapproval of participation in global institutions, and she reaffirmed the importance of international cooperation and what the West has come to call the rules-based order. In a speech to the National Security College of the Australian National University, she stated that Australia's interests are not served by stepping away and leaving others to shape global order for us. Isolationism would also cut us off from the world on which we are so dependent for our own security and prosperity in the world's most dynamic region, the Indo-Pacific. She said, "We must stand up for our values and bring influence to bear in these institutions to protect and promote our national interests and to preserve the open character of international institutions based on universal values of transparency." All good and sensible stuff. But Marise Payne's pivot in 2020 on Scott Morrison's isolationist rhetoric of 2019 was unfortunately couched in such a way that it could only reinforce the oppositional nationalistic discourse. It reinforced the characterisation of China as one of a handful of countries intent on undermining liberal democracy and promoting their own more authoritarian models, and doing so by means of disinformation during a pandemic, no less. As she said, "For our part, it's troubling that some countries are using the pandemic to undermine liberal democracy, to promote their own more authoritarian models." Ms. Payne cited Russia, China and Turkey as the purveyors of this disinformation. No mention was made of President Trump's splashes of disinformation about the source of the pandemic. While we may have reason to believe that all these countries engage in disinformation, little if any evidence has been apparent in China's history that supports the notion that it is using that disinformation with an intention of seriously undermining, meaning toppling, less authoritarian, liberal democratic governments. If we have seen undermining of Western democracies in the last half-decade, it has been coming more from within them than from China. Just look at America under Trump. So Marise Payne's continued goading of China merely extends the recent practice of casting it in the light of an enemy, and one with the sort of threatening intentions of global hegemony that it has actually never displayed before. On the contrary, these are intentions that have been displayed on and off through the ages by Britain, Spain, France, Russia, Germany, Japan and the United States. They're not prominent in China's history at all, which gives rise to the question of whether Australia's government, in connecting disinformation with an intention on China's part of destabilising democracies, is simply trying to confect a new enemy to frighten Australians and building impressions that disinformation is practiced in China and not by Australia. The fact is, it's practiced by several Western countries, not least America, the UK and Australia. We practiced it, for instance, in the case of false information put about that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Disinformation clearly meant to garner domestic support for our entry into an illegal and heinous war from which the world is unlikely to recover inside a century. Australia went into that war alongside the US and the UK, notwithstanding the clear lack of support from every other country. In comparison to this, evidence of any malignant intent by China towards the Western world pales. And Marise Payne's speech makes no attempt to reduce the Western habitual practice of disregard of evidence when setting foreign policy, the sort of disregard that led Australia into what is now acknowledged as a regrettable, pugilistic mistake. Indeed, in her speech, it is as though, in reverting to support for multilateralism, the government still couldn't resist singling out China as both a threat and unsupportive of the post-war rules-based order, despite the fact that evidence is anything but abundant for this characterisation of China. When China joined the rules-based order by entering the World Trade Organization, it actually made massive changes in its laws to fit in with, rather than undermine, the West's rules. Certainly, since China began to open up its economy and culture to participation in global markets, it hasn't always abided by the West's rules. The main example of this was China's disregard for the binding application of the law of the sea and the rulings of the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague over its construction of military installations in the South China Sea. But you could say they learned that from the West, and even from Australia, since we disregarded the binding application of exactly the same international law in order to steal East Timor's rightful revenues from its oil reserves in 2004. And we did it to steal them for a private corporation, Woodside, not even for national purposes. And we undermined proceedings launched by East Timor in the International Court of Justice in The Hague to cover up our illegal acts in bugging East Timor's cabinet meetings. The fact is that lots of countries have disregarded international laws when it has suited them, and will continue to do so. Australians need to factor that reality into their strategies for avoiding global conflict. What we have to glean from all this, if we're developing a strategic plan for Australia's security in a globalised world, is that persistence with Maurice Payne's unsubtle oppositional language in our diplomacy is dangerous for Australia, economically and militarily. And much of this is completely unnecessary and otherwise easily avoidable. It really only functions effectively to distract Australians from the real threats to their democracy and values, threats from within Australia that I'll discuss in section 4. Australians are witnessing the rise of oppositional discourse in our attitudes to international relations. And although we can gain nothing from this, we are still free to choose that tactic, and if we so please, we can brandish our preferences for a free liberal democracy over the more authoritarian preferences of countries like China. Alternatively, we can choose cooperative stances, recognising that making that choice does not require us to sacrifice our values or sovereignty at all. We can have cooperation and still retain sovereignty. But we can't gain as much from cooperative stances if we implement them with judgmentalism and assumptions of the moral superiority of Western values over Eastern, bearing in mind that our own track record of human rights is not pristine. Such a moderation, cooperation with a little less judgmentalism, would reinstate some of the mutual respect we enjoyed with China before Canberra started turning Australians against it. Since the 2019 federal election, Canberra has chosen a stark oppositional stance, mainly for purposes of domestic political messaging meant to signal to Australians that the government will protect us from authoritarianism, even though it is introducing authoritarianisms of its own, reducing the human rights of Australians and particularly dampening free speech and a free press. Australian politicians like to boast that Australia observes the rule of law and that China doesn't, and that this means Australia has superior values to China. Western and Eastern cultures in the 21st century are both highly developed and stylised, and we are living through a period of competition about which value set is the best. The US has developed a fear that history may show that authoritarian regimes run along the lines of China's value system do capitalism better than Western liberal democracies. After all, China's authoritarianism has just pulled over 800 million Chinese out of poverty in only 40 years. And in that period, China's share of world GDP increased from less than 3% to about 20%. So they certainly do capitalism quite successfully. For the West then, there is a lot riding on ensuring that as China rises even further, it does so by following the rules set by the West. But in the West, and this is an unfortunate piece of timing, the foundations of the rule of law and the wider rules-based system we ostensibly value so highly are under threat not from China, but from within advanced Western countries. In Australia, rights for the accused and victims, rights to presumption of innocence, rights to free speech and assembly, and rights to open justice for all are under challenge. We brandish our liberal democracy, but it's getting less liberal by the year, and not because of anything China is doing. Still, regardless of differences between the values of Western and Eastern cultures in the 21st century and whose will turn out to be better, what matters more in terms of Australia's capacity to build and consolidate its soft power is whether our values are seen to be observed by us. To criticise others' values, we should at least be seen to live by ours. Otherwise, we just set ourselves up for a big fall in credibility in the eyes of other nations, and a consequent big blow to our soft power. Unfortunately, in Australia, it is not evident in 2020 that we're doing our best to live by our espoused values. A key feature of societies with the rule of law is that everyone is equal before the law, and that the state itself is subject to the law. In China, the Communist Party is the law, and its members are therefore, in reality, above it. But in Australia, recently, we too have shifted quietly to a system where equality before the law is diminishing, where some Australians, particularly those operating illegally in intelligence agencies, are now above the law, and where governments have actually frustrated the development of systems in which they and other government agencies can be held accountable under the law. For instance, by refusals to establish a federal corruption watchdog, or by legislation which gives immunity from prosecution to some agents of our increasingly elite security establishment. The government has also been reducing the rights of some to presumption of innocence, particularly vulnerable welfare recipients, as the robo-debt scandal has shown. Some accused are being denied access to evidence essential to their defence. Laws curtailing freedom of speech and assembly are multiplying unreasonably. Some of these laws criminalise public protest as though it is espionage, and the right to trial in open court is being withdrawn without demonstration that secret trials are in the national interest. Refugees are being held for years without charge. For examples of all this, viewers can view Episode 3 and Episode 4 Part 1 in this series of the State of Australia. The list of our violations of legal conventions we've supported since Magna Carta is now quite a long one. And every time we do something to reduce our rights or in violation of our espoused values, it's noticed internationally, as it was when in late 2020 the Brereton Report was released, which gave credible evidence of war crimes committed by Australians in Afghanistan. Australia should have been given credit for addressing that as an open democracy valuing truth and the rule of law. But because we had been pumping out messages about the superiority of our values to China's, all we got was an image on Twitter, which most Australians rejected as fake, but which was actually a stingingly accurate symbolic representation of our behaviour, and not just of some soldiers, but of our whole strategy of militarist intervention into the sovereignty of other countries. When the mirror was held up, we didn't like seeing it, but we really need to have a good look at ourselves if we want to lord it over others and their value systems. A more secure Australia requires an examination of the real and more immediate threats to our democracy, the threats from within. This is absolutely vital if we wish to develop a strategy for a more secure future for Australia on the international stage in an inevitably and irreversibly globalised 21st century. So in the last section, I'll look at strategy. Regardless of the obvious contradiction between our espoused values about the rule of law and democracy and our adherence to those values, the message instilling an overriding fear of Chinese autocracy has quickly caught on domestically in Australia, as the Lowy poll shows. Apparently, as of 2020, 59% of Australians agree that the government has got the balance right between the need for press freedom and the need to enforce the law and protect national security. It seems a majority of us are comfortable with the recent increase in suppression of our free press and free speech because we now somehow connect that to a need to keep us safe from implied foreign security threats. This in a climate where the Australian government has tipped the balance so much in favour of national security and against press freedom that even the conservative Murdoch press began complaining about criminalisation of journalism and joined with all the other more progressive media organisations to protest in the Right to Know campaign mounted in late 2019. Australians are apparently being lulled into an idea that national security and freedom of speech are somehow mutually exclusive, that security is threatened by free speech, that security is threatened by the very value the government purports to hold dear, namely liberality in our democracy. Almost 60% of us are happy with the recent rise in threats from our government to a free press and government denials of our right to know when government itself may be acting contrary to the public interest. The Prime Minister has stated that this government will not be coerced by an unaccountable international bureaucracy, by which he means the UN. But his government is undoubtedly removing the means by which it can be held accountable domestically. If this keeps up, we'll end up with the autocracy we criticise in China and a world unable to cooperate into the bargain. The madness of all this is that it suggests that if we want to protect our values, we have to do away with the very things we say we value, namely an open society where journalism and protest are not criminalised, and a democracy where freedoms are not curtailed. It suggests we have to forsake these values to be secure from the countries we think might threaten those values. More, it suggests that if and only if we forsake these values, will we be secure from the sorts of threats to freedom that we are witnessing in China as it struggles to do the same things for its people that we want to do, but in their case, to do it on a scale that Australians have never had to contemplate, a scale that will lift more than 1 billion of its citizens out of poverty. This by no means excuses China for its violations of human rights. But in the last 40 years, China has lifted its citizens from centuries of poverty and done so within its borders. Other nations have not been exposed to floods of economic refugees from China in the way that, say, large numbers of the world's most miserable from some other countries have had to seek refuge in any friendly nation that might behave decently. It might be politely suggested that we should say thank you to the Chinese for not adding to floods of diaspora and at least acknowledge that on this performance, Chinese authoritarianism can't be entirely indicted, obvious human rights abuses notwithstanding. China's authoritarianism, like that of many authoritarian countries, some of which purport to be democracies, probably could be indicted in a quasi-court of international opinion. But we still have no evidence in China's history that it may harbour imperialist ambitions and may seek to impose its way of doing things on other countries. Such evidence may be hiding in the shadows. But even if that is so, it does us no good to strike at the shadow from our current weakened state as an ethical democratic power, particularly since the reality is that Australians are at more immediate risk of loss of our freedoms from our own government than we are from China. And we are now at risk of losing the economic benefits that have accrued in less fractious times during China's rise. What we have arrived at in 2020 is a state of mind in Australia and in the wider Western world that has not yet reconciled itself to China's rise and its growing influence in the multilateral institutions we've been used to dominating as a Western power. But the rise, not just of China, but of Asia, is going to spell the end of this. And in the face of that impending end of the West's domination, an adjustment will be required from the West and from Australia. We can be dragged to the adjustment, kicking against our loss of status, or we can remake our status, basing it on a stronger, inclusive and ethical foundation. Two pillars, perhaps. One pillar of support for the current basis on which international peace and progress is secured, that rule of law we exalt in but don't always observe, and another pillar which may offer a new brushstroke on that uniting force, a brushstroke being suggested by China, a shared humanity. In 2017, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Xi Jinping gave a speech calling on members of the international community to work together to build a community of a shared future for humanity. Several commentators have since responded with cynicism about China's sincerity in this suggestion. They've also responded with scepticism about whether the suggestion sits well with Western values, as they have been set out under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and of course the violations on human rights by China that have come to light more recently since the speech have not helped calm the scepticism. Inherently, though, there is nothing in Xi Jinping's call for a shared humanity that modern democratic nations need disparage. Those who value their liberty as individuals, which is probably all of us, might balk at any undertone of shared humanity that suggests a loss of rights as individuals. But if we balk to the extent that we reject a shared humanity, where does it get us in a world where more than 7 billion other individuals are crowding together into a future, clamouring for a share? Finding a way to share that future is not an unreasonable call from the Third World. What would be unreasonable, indeed futile, and just plain childish, is a future where those from the First World refuse to share. Say what we like about the possible naivety of viewing China as a friend rather than a threat, the fact remains that it is futile and self-defeating to suppose that a bunch of fearful attitudes about China suffices as a way of dealing with China. These attitudes might be correct, but clinging to them uncritically solves nothing. It simply leaves Australia with a policy and strategy vacuum, and that will not protect the national interest. As I said earlier, it's much more likely to protect the interests of a privileged few. Indeed, that is exactly what is being primarily protected by this late shift in attitudes to China and the international stoking of distrust among Australians about China's overtures to the rest of the world. What the world is witnessing here is not so much a shift that undermines democracies as it is a shift in the way capital and access to capital are controlled. Lending of capital used to be controlled by the Western world, but that is changing, and China has entered the market of capital lending, and it is doing so in a competitive way that offers mutual benefits. This is why 130 countries have freely signed Belt and Road agreements in various forms with China. Put simply, China's offering them better deals. By contrast, since 2014, Australia has been reducing its support in loans and aid for those countries, which is self-defeating economically and strategically. Instead, we are raising investment in defence to such an extent that by 2031, defence expenditures will constitute over 9% of the federal annual budget, making defence the second highest expenditure on any single item. It will also steeply raise defence spending as a share of GDP from the current 1.9% to 2.4%, whereas expenditures on foreign aid will be capped at their current level of well less than 1% of the federal budget and a mere 0.2% of GDP. This might sound good to some Australians, but every extra dollar the federal government is planning to spend in building up defence capability, an extremely expensive strategy that is destined to fail, would be far more effectively spent as aid to other countries to help them deal with their problems within their own borders and prevent both potential refugee inflows and military activity. Increased expenditure on foreign aid plus more money for diplomacy would be better still. Australia is allowing itself to be cut out of the benefits that come through providing foreign aid and capital lending. In this context, it is clear that the recent backlash against China's Belt and Road Initiative is all too obviously motivated by Western sources of capital having lately become very snarly about clearly effective competition from China. The Western near monopoly in supply of capital is fading. The tactic has been to try to stop this market transformation by characterising the Belt and Road Initiative as a security threat. But the far more immediate threat is to the market dominance of established investors from Western countries. That struggle for dominance in capitalism is what ordinary Australians are caught in and will be caught in for at least the next decade. To allow ourselves to be led down the path of thinking that it is something else, some drastic, unprecedented challenge to democracy, is simply to allow ourselves to be distracted from the need to develop a strategy to address the economic challenges and seize the economic opportunities from the rise of Asia. We can still seize these opportunities, but as long as Australia's federal government refuses to develop a mature strategy which factors in the inevitability of the rise of China and the complete futility of trying to contain it, this is where the real undermining of our national interests will occur. Australia's foreign policy in late 2020 outwardly protests that containment of China is not our objective. But no Australian leader has denied that since 2017 we have indeed done at least 14 things to antagonise China without reason. 14 things they loudly complained about in late 2020 in response to the megaphone diplomacy that has injudiciously been indulged in by Australia since 2017. China clearly interprets our actions as discriminatory along purely racial lines and as doing the bidding of the US in its attempts not to just contain China, but to weaken it strategically and economically. This is a zero-sum game for the US. Their strategies since their pivot to Asia, introduced under the Obama administration, are based on win-lose, not win-win. But as we fall into participating in that, we do nothing other than court an easy lashback from China, a lashback that comes with little risk to China since it is not aimed directly or even indirectly at the US and costs China far less than it costs Australia. In doing these 14 things that China has been able to list as facts, Australia has done nothing more and nothing less than set itself up to be the site of a proxy Cold War between the US and China on trade and ideology. Chances are the US and China will walk away from this skirmish of history, brushing it off as nothing. But Australia will be left to pay a price that as a small nation we can ill afford. In the last 3 years of the 2010 decade, Australia weakened its diplomacy and turned towards a hawkish foreign strategy that is suitable only for use by big powers, not small or middle ones. But by doing that, we have drawn fire towards our economy while creating a saloon passage for the US in the trade war it started with China under Trump. The hawks in the US, those weapons manufacturers who now help fund the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, must be laughing. Their money's been well spent. It has brought Australia to a point where, in only 3 years, we've completely turned around the economic good fortune we enjoyed with the rise of China. And for what? To protect our sovereignty? We've protected our sovereignty not a whit. The lesson for strategic planners should be a simple one here. Don't build a security plan that makes you a target. Quite accurately, in late 2020, China is telling Australia point blank that if we make China the enemy, China will be the enemy. They mean it economically, not militarily. They don't have to resort to military aggression against Australia or suppression of our democracy. Far, far cheaper simply to impose economic sanctions on us. So why on earth we are making ourselves the target here defies comprehension. If Australians prefer the less futile course through the current transformation of world markets, then the best option, given the inevitability of the West's adjustment to its power, is to continue to draw China into the existing international negotiation forums to act in accordance with the rules-based order, the rule of international law and agreements. It will be harder to do this if we don't act in accordance with the rules ourselves, such as on climate change agreements and on fair trade. At the moment, Australia is not able to claim integrity in this. We have resorted to cheap accounting tricks to avoid meeting our commitments under the Paris Agreement on climate change, and we have commenced proceedings against China's actions over barley tariffs in the World Trade Organization, apparently assuming that the WTO will be on our side. But the Chinese can easily counterclaim with proceedings about Australia's ban on Huawei's involvement in our 5G network. We can mire both nations in expensive legal wrangles, if we please, or we can accept China's offer of a shared humanity at face value and build genuine mutual respect. The mutual respect approach is bound to be cheaper and safer. Australia's international relations are verging towards the fractious and away from the cooperative. They're verging precisely to the place the authors of the Australian National Outlook said they shouldn't approach. Having said that, our institutions are still dearly valued and have merit for use in creating a peaceful world. Democratic values in the West have suffered some attacks recently from within the West itself. In Australia's case, the things undermining our liberal democracy in 2020 have little, if anything, to do with China. China is more an image that has been remade in the minds of Australians to distract us from the immediate threats to our democracy, from such things as national COVID-19 commissions, which operate in anything other than the values of transparency that Maurice Payne insists are inherent only in Western democracies. One thing is certain: transparency is not something being supported by Australia's democratically elected government in 2020. Nevertheless, Australia's genuine, legitimate, democratic institutions can still be revived to ensure Australia can play a more engaged and mutually beneficial role as a good, if not great, global leader. The state of Australia is not a complete failure in this regard, but it needs some careful thought and a stronger, indeed genuine commitment to openness and transparency at home if we're to secure a prosperous and peaceful future. It's worth observing that in the draft Vision for Australia Together, the first thing that's listed as vital is that we are safe. There's a reason for this. It arises from the fact that when people are surveyed about what they most want for the future, safety always seems to come up first, even before financial security. But current federal policy on foreign relations is not set up to make us safe. It's being set up in a manner that can only expose us to unnecessary risk and loss. At the end of 2020, with Joe Biden's election as President of the United States, we're not likely to see a break in this pattern. He has announced a summit of democracies to be held in 2021. This is more likely to make things worse than better. As democracies huddle together to make an enemy of authoritarian countries, they will not make us safe. It will merely fabricate a problem that doesn't yet exist by asserting that threats to democracy are coming from external authoritarian regimes, particularly China, instead of from their own internal authoritarian attacks on democratic instruments. It will increase global confrontation. At the same time, this exclusive huddle of democracies will prevent resolution of the big problems that do exist: climate change, pandemics, mass refugee migrations, and nuclear proliferation. These problems require cooperation, not confrontation. They're shared problems which ignore borders and are completely resistant to resolution through nationalism. To defeat shared problems, we would do better to grab China's offer of a shared humanity before it is withdrawn and meld the aspirations and values of the West with the aspirations and values of the East. The East, Asia, is not going away. It's best to work together. In 2020, Australians are being made to think that foreign powers are challenging our sovereignty as a democracy, when in fact it's really all just about capital dominance. It's about money for the privileged. That being so, the path through to a safe future for those of us who will never control the distribution of wealth depends in large part not just on how well our governments behave, but on how our corporate leaders behave. In the absence of the necessary decent international leadership from our government, or in its intermittent lapses, Australia needs its corporate leaders to step up, to act less in the interests of a very wealthy few and more in the interests of the nation state that makes it possible for those corporations to operate in Australia in the first place. Hence the next issue in this series of the State of Australia in 2020, issue number 11 on corporate irresponsibility. Australia needs to understand the potential impact of unethical corporate conduct by overly influential parts of the business sector, particularly the fossil fuel industry, the financial sector, and the conservative Murdoch media, if we expect to build a plan to increase our influence as a middle power and use that power in the nation's best interests. Australians wishing to travel towards a more secure, peaceful and prosperous future can increase their chances of arriving there by developing a plan which re-establishes Australia as a truly open democracy and a responsible international negotiator with all the ethics in governance at home and abroad that entails. Australia Together is being developed by Australians to help ensure we can integrate our efforts along multiple lines and travel efficiently to that more secure future. You can become involved in developing Australia Together by visiting the ACFP website at www.austcfp.com.au. Thanks for watching this episode. For further episodes in this series of the State of Australia in 2020, visit the ACFP website. If you like this episode, please click like on the YouTube page and share the episode with your friends and subscribe to this channel.